Hi, I'm Dr. Nathan Carr. I'm a professor of TESOL at California State University, Fullerton. I'm currently serving as a Fulbright Scholar with a teaching fellowship at Princess Alia University College, part of Al Balqa Applied University here in Amman, Jordan. This is a Fulbright knowledge sharing presentation I'm doing on behalf of the Collateral Repair Project to help with their teacher training, especially for any of their volunteer teachers who haven't had any formal teacher training in how to teach English. And this is going to focus on types of language practice activities and the various lesson plan phases that you can get in, that you would have normally in different types of lessons that focus on speaking. So it won't include reading, listening, or writing. So first, I'll give you a very brief overview of this presentation. First, there'll be a very brief theoretical foundation, just a little bit. Then I'll talk about the types of language practice activities that we would have in classes that are focusing on speaking, and that would be conversation, grammar, and pronunciation lessons. And then I'll talk about the lesson plan phases for these different lesson types that focus on speaking. Again, it'll be conversation in general and grammar and pronunciation. So first, a few definitions. And will be the first thing I talk about in theoretical foundations. Then I'll talk about an overview of instructed second language learning and selected principles from a book chapter by Rod Ellis. I won't go through all 12 of them, just a few. And then I'll talk about scaffolding and responsibility. That's all the theory we need here, I think. So first, authentic. I'm going to use this the way it's used in the language testing literature, meaning similar to real life. It simulates or imitates real life. Genuine is what I'll use when I'm talking about actual real life language materials or activities, not something simulated in the classroom. Now, just to make things more fun, you'll sometimes see books that talk about authentic meaning genuine. I'm, again, using it in the way it's used in the assessment literature, since that's my research area. Another term you may come across if you ever read teacher training books is negotiate meaning. And this is a popular buzzword. A lot of people don't seem to know what it means, but we know the students are supposed to do it. What it is really is an interactive process where learners or speakers are working together to reach mutual understanding. So you say something, I say, you mean? You go, no, I mean, oh, you mean that? Yeah. There's not actually, I'll give you a dinar for, if you tell me something. It's trying to make sure we agree on what's being said. And that's all it is. You go back and forth until you resolve the communication difficulties. It turns out that's very helpful for students who are trying to acquire a language. So, Rod Ellis wrote a very nice overview a few years back of instructed second language learning research. He came up with 12 principles that he distilled from the research on the topic. This is separate from naturalistic SLA research. Turns out there aren't a lot of jobs in naturalistic. The jobs are all in teaching people. The problem is that theory and research don't always agree on how instruction can best promote SLA. There's the distinction between focus on forms and focus on form, and I'm not going to get near that argument right now. Or is there some combination of the two? Ellis, I think, wisely tries to keep out of the getting drawn into that fray as well. There's another issue, though, besides disagreements sometimes in the research literature. What works best for one learner may not work best for others. I personally learn languages in a way that I would not recommend teaching other people. It's not as efficient. My brain works that way, though, and I recognize that I'm odd. And okay, it works. But with that being said, we have to start somewhere. We can't just say, well, we're just not going to teach language. We're just going to make things up as we go along until we have complete and final agreement on every point. There are some things that have become fairly clear from the research over the last, century or so, or more. I'm going to focus on 5 of these, especially number 6, 7, and 8. Yeah, 2 and 3 also, I think, are important, though. because instruction needs to ensure that learners focus predominantly on meaning. Mainly, they need to focus on communicating meaning, less so than on the forms of the language and perfect accuracy. But they should also focus on form. They shouldn't ignore accuracy, but their primary focus needs to be on meaning. And moving then down, and all of these are important, but this is a short presentation, and I just want to hit these 5. Number 6, successful instructed language learning requires extensive L2 input. Now, there were previous theories like Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis was that comprehensible input was all you needed to acquire a language, as opposed to learning. And if you're curious about that, it's pretty easy to go look that up. Now, most people agree you need input, you need a lot of L2 input that you can comprehend, but that's not enough by itself. Number 7, most researchers and most practitioners agree students also need opportunities for output. And this is sustained output, not just saying a word. It's like, what color is my shirt? And the student says, blue. Okay, good. The student has had their output for the day and they're done. Except that's not enough. They need to try actually communicating at more than the one-word level, unless it's like their first day of class maybe. Then number 8, students have to have an opportunity to interact in the L2. That interaction practice is central to developing their L2 proficiency. If you're learning to play the piano, you don't just play the right hand and then just play the left hand. You have to practice playing with both hands at the same time also. If you're playing basketball, you can't just run, with the ball, and you can't just dribble, and you can't just shoot. You have to be able to do all 3. I couldn't do probably 2 of those together very well, which is why I never played basketball. But the language learning is a lot like that. So the students need input. They need a lot of L2 input. They need opportunities for output, especially sustained output. And they need opportunities to interact in the L2. And if you don't get those, it's going to be very difficult for you to become fluent in the language you're studying. And the last point on the theoretical foundations is scaffolding and responsibility. Scaffolding is systematic support for students in the learning process. It's a term coined by Bruner and his colleagues, building on Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And high scaffolding is associated with depending on the teacher for output. It's associated with having explicit instruction, a lot of modeling, and guidance. As learner competence improves, then scaffolding or support decreases. As the scaffolding decreases, learners take more responsibility for their performance and their learning. And decreased scaffolding is associated with less focus on instruction and on modeling, more focus on coaching, facilitating learning, the teacher standing back, letting the students interact, and probably make a few mistakes, but they're actually communicating. Also monitoring their performance. The teacher isn't just standing off, texting or something while the students talk. The teacher is actively monitoring how they're doing, listening to see if someone's having trouble. It's also associated with encouraging communication and feedback between the students. They're doing most of the talking. That's why the teacher is doing more coaching and more monitoring, walking around, listening and encouraging, helping when they need it. And then it's finally also decreased scaffolding is also associated with providing corrective feedback on task performance. You don't want to interrupt them in the middle of something unless it's a really big mistake. But at the end, you can point things out either to individual students or just say in general, I heard some people say this, I heard some people do that, and address that, and maybe everyone benefits from that and no one feels singled out. Now, all this high scaffolding, low scaffolding thing is a dynamic process. We have high scaffolding again when we introduce some new text type or some new task type. Next, I'll talk about types of language practice activities. And these, again, are for speaking, grammar, pronunciation, not for reading, listening, or writing lessons. So one thing to mention is how the types of language practice activities and how using authentic activities can help maintain student interest. Again, there's the caveat. I'm going to talk about controlled practice, guided practice, communicative practice, or practice production. But by moving up from more scaffolded to less scaffolded activities, from more controlled to more open or freer practice, that's going to help with the students as they'll get more comfortable with whatever it is we're trying to teach them and using that to communicate without being scripted. Another thing, and we build or maintain student interest with two different things. First, there's a tension between scaffolding and a manageable level of challenge. Or I say a tension, there's also an interaction. The scaffolding helps keep the level of challenge manageable, and we should withdraw the scaffolding, give them more and more authentic tasks, which have less and less support, more and more like real life language use, but not make things too challenging, so that they're getting pushed a little, but not overwhelmed. That's important. The other thing is that by giving them authentic activities, they'll see that this stuff they're learning has real world applicability. If this is something that they could imagine themselves, or at least someone they know, doing in real life with English, then, okay, this kind of makes sense. This seems more valuable to me. If it's talking about 18th century poets, okay, if you're into 18th century poetry, that's fine, but most students are not, and that's not going to motivate them in their beginning English class or intermediate or advanced. So that's not what I would use for the conversation class. With English majors, okay, maybe so. So talk about controlled practice, guided practice, communicative practice activities, and I'm going to start with the two ends of the spectrum, controlled and communicative. Controlled practice tends to be teacher-centered, tends to be manipulative, that is language manipulation, not manipulating the students. It tends to be structured, and it tends to have predicted student responses. We know what we want them to say, we know what the right answer is. Communicative practice tends to be authentic, that is simulating real-life language use tasks, especially from parts of the real world that we want to prepare our students for. It tends to be student-centered. It tends to be focused on communication of meaning. We don't want to ignore accuracy, ignore language forms, but the primary focus should be on meaning. And then the forms matter because they help with conveying meaning. Communicative practice tends to be open-ended, and it tends to have unpredicted responses. We know what they're going to talk about, but we don't know what they're going to say, or we don't know how they're going to say it. So we have the controlled versus communicative, and communicative is sometimes called free or open-ended practice. Those are fairly easy to distinguish, I think. There's guided practice then, which is sometimes also known as semi-controlled practice, although I don't like semi-controlled as a term. I think guided is much closer to communicative practice than it is to controlled. So guided is somewhere between controlled and communicative practice. Now, the dividing line between controlled and guided practice is sometimes fuzzy, usually not. But once in a while, there's an activity, and is that controlled or is that guided? And I have to scratch my head and say, well, it's kind of on the line. So make sure you do it after the last of the other controlled practice and before any of the other guided practice. And whichever one it is, the activity's pretty good, so it doesn't matter exactly which bucket it falls in. Just, don't put it too late, don't put it too early. Now, with that being said, again, usually 9 times out of 10, it's pretty easy to tell whether it's guided or controlled. But guided and communicative, the line is very often fuzzy. There's a textbook that I use in my graduate pronunciation methods course, and I love that book. It's an amazing book. It's a great reference. Every full-time teacher ought to have it on their shelf. But I sometimes disagree about whether a given example activity is guided or communicative. It's like, well, no, this one's communicative. Shouldn't be in the guided examples. And then turn the page. Well, that's a great activity, but that belongs on the page before with the guided stuff. That's not really communicative. But the thing is, you can change a detail a lot of times and make the guided become communicative, or you can make a communicative activity become guided. For instance, if you give them sentence frames, how to say this, give them some guidance on how to say something, the communicative activity moves closer to the guided direction, or moves in that direction. If you take away some of the scaffolding or have them do a little more open-ended task, not going after such small specific pieces of information, a controlled activity starts becoming a guided activity, starts becoming communicative. And then closing this up, there are two very similar paradigms for describing what we do in a communicative lesson. We have PPP, which is a very well-known method, goes back to the early 70s. It's presentation, practice, production, and that's the one I'm going to emphasize here. But we can also talk about presentation, controlled practice, guided practice, communicative practice. The thing is, they're the same paradigm. Excuse me. They both start with pronunciation with presentation, although in a pronunciation lesson we might call that description and analysis. The controlled practice focuses on accuracy and automaticity. The communicative practice focuses on meaning and communication, and guided practice is sort of moving from the bigger focus on accuracy and automaticity towards more of a focus on the meaning and communication. So it's a transitionary stage. But the guided and communicative practice really make up two parts of production. Controlled practice is virtually the same as practice. These lines that I have circled with red there, they're really closer together than they appear. It's just in PowerPoint, I can't get the lines any closer than that. I wanted to have a tiny gap between them. That's not as tiny as I wanted, unfortunately. But let's say I buy 2 pizzas from the same place, the same size pizza, and I cut one pizza into 6 slices, and I cut the other pizza into 12 slices. Which pizza is bigger? Which one has more pizza? Well, if you're 5 years old, obviously it's the one with 12 slices. But I think it's around, age 7 or so, we go through a mental transition stage and we realize it's the same amount of pizza. It's just more slices, but they're smaller. And that's this. This is the same thing. You don't do PPP because you only want 2 activities, and you think with controlled, guided, communicative, I'd need 3 activities. No. I don't know how many controlled practice or just practice activities you need. It depends on your students, depends on what they're learning and how hard it is. Depends on if they've learned it before. Likewise, for production, it's not that you need 1 guided, 1 communicative. You might need 2 guided, 2 communicative, or 3 and 2, 2 and 3, 1 and 2. It just depends on what your students need to be able to use that learning point without having to look at the book or look at their notes, and to be able to do it without having a script. So some examples of controlled practice activities would include dialogue recitation or narrative recitation. It's when you recite something, whether it's in unison, chorally, or if it's individual. Reading aloud or oral reading. That includes reading dialogues. That's controlled practice. Having it be a dialogue, if it's being read, it doesn't magically become something else. It's still just controlled practice. There's only one right way to read it. Display question and answer exchanges are also controlled. display questions when the teacher already knows the correct answer or the limited range of correct answers. Wants to see whether the student knows the answer. For example, what color is my shirt? Well, if you remember, it was blue, it still is. That's the only correct answer. Drills are controlled practice. Translation is controlled practice. Dictation activities are controlled practice. And copying activities are controlled practice. All of that's controlled practice. Guided practice. Some examples include storytelling by the students, referential question and answer exchanges, and a referential question is when the teacher does not know the answer beforehand. So instead of saying, what color is my shirt? I say, what did you do last weekend? I have no idea what you did last weekend. I expect you're going to use some past tense verbs, but that's about all. Probably it's going to be something from normal life. Maybe you took a trip, maybe you went to the mall, maybe you stayed home and did homework or cleaned the house, or you stayed on the sofa and watched Netflix all day. I don't expect you're going to tell me that you got kidnapped by aliens and then returned, just at the end of the weekend. I guess it could happen, but there's a pretty unlimited range of the potential answers. Also, information transfer is a type of guided practice. That's where the students convert information from one mode to another. For example, when they listen to information and they fill out a diagram based on what they heard. Information gap or information exchange activities are a quintessential guided practice activity. That's an activity that involves two-way communication. Each person is missing some information that's necessary for completing the task, and students or groups of students have to get the missing information from the other students. Usually this means one student has the student A handout and one student has the student B handout. That could be on a piece of paper. It could be you had them download it to their phones. And the last example I'll give for guided practice is having students write and perform a role play. Whether they're reading it aloud or they're writing it and then memorizing it, it's still writing it and performing it. That's still guided practice. It is not communicative practice. This can be okay sometimes, but it is not a stopping place. It should not be overused because after you've done this, if you're a student, you're still not quite ready probably even to do a real role play, much less to go out in the real world and use the language that you've just been taught. So you need to be able to practice using it in class, but again, you have to build up to it. This could be part of the building up process, but if you're having them write something and then act it out and then move to the next lesson, they're really not done with the first lesson. Now, some examples of communicative practice include role plays. A role play is a relatively free acting out of specified roles and functions. There's drama, where you have the dramatic rendition of a play, a skit, or story. And yes, that's memorized, but we generally consider that communicative, I guess, because of how long the presentation is. Problem-solving activities are communicative activities, communicative practice. And this is an activity that involves like a specific problem with limited means to resolve it. Students have to cooperate in groups. A really classic example of this would be the lifeboat thing. You're on a ship, it's about to sink, you get in a lifeboat, and there are 20 things for you to take, but you only can choose 10 to take to the island that you're going to be stranded on. You probably need 15, really. To get by, but you get to choose 10, and so your group has to figure that out. That's a problem-solving one. It doesn't help that I once saw a book of problem-solving activities, and it called them simulations, but a simulation is something a little different. Simulation is an activity that involves complex interaction between groups and individuals based on simulation of real-life actions and experiences. Well, what does that mean? Well, usually you've got some sort of a project and the students are doing it in English. It could be, if they're engineers, they could plan a bridge. an imaginary bridge, but they do the plan. Where are they going to put the bridge? How are they going to design it? And every week they update the class on their project. Or if it's a business English class, they could be doing something about finance. You give every group $1 million of fake money, and you should give them some places to look at stock prices. Each group maybe would create its own mutual fund, and they have to they don't really buy the stocks, but they say, okay, we're going to buy this much of that stock, this much of that stock, and this is how much we'll hold in cash. And the first week they maybe talk about what kind of fund they're setting up and why, what their orientation is. And then they talk about the fund performance, what they did in the past week for rebalancing it. And did they buy something, sell something, hold something? What did they do and why? Talk about that every week for several weeks, and just see how they did. That would be a simulation. Interviews are a classic type of communication, and you have a student get information from one or more other students. Discussions and debates are also communicative practice. The composition, which you don't do too much in speaking class, I know, but when you write about your ideas, you write a story, you write a project results, whatever, that would be communicative practice. And presentations or oral reports, those, whether it's ideas, a story, project results, whatever. And again, yes, that's written down, but presumably the students are talking from notes. They're not reading everything word for word. So that's also definitely communicative activity. So I'm going to go through a few of these, and I'll pause for a few seconds so you have time to hit pause on the video to think. So on number 1, after the teacher explains the difference between the simple past and the present perfect, students do a worksheet where they write the correct verb form in the blank. Go ahead and pause. Okay, if they're doing a worksheet, that would be controlled practice. All they're doing is plugging in the verb. Number 2, students in pairs do an information gap activity to help practice simple past versus present perfect. I'll pause for 3 seconds. Okay, I hope you said it was guided practice, because information gap activities are prototypical guided practice, almost always. You could have one that's going to be communicative, but usually information gap has simpler pieces of information being exchanged. But if it's a longer piece of information, it would be communicative. In this example, though, it's maybe a little bit towards the high end of guided. I would still say it's guided. And why am I not advancing? There. Number 3, students in pairs do a role play. I'll pause here. Okay, it's a role play. That makes it a communicative activity. And number 4, students make a list of 10 things that they often, but not necessarily always, do during a week. And in pairs, they take turns asking each other about whether they've done each thing on their list this week. They take notes, and they change partners, and they report the first partner's activities to the new partner. And this would be a communicative activity. You could say that the first part is maybe more guided, but especially taking notes and then reporting on what the other person said, that's going to be communicative. Number 5, students write a timeline with 10 events from their own lives. They trade the timelines around the room and form pairs, and then they take turns going through the timeline. They tell their partner what the writer has done before. Now, adding to this, you have 5 sentences that should use ago and 5 with year. So, for example, Ron has visited Egypt before. He went there 5 years ago. He has bought a new car before. He bought one in 2022. I would say this is communicative practice, but it's a little towards the low end because you're guiding them to use ago and in year. So this is probably going to be communicative, but it's not highly, highly authentic, but it's still not bad. Number 6, the class does a drill to practice using the present perfect with ever. Have you ever done this? Yes, I have. No, I haven't. If it's a drill, that's controlled practice. And the last slide of these, students write out and perform a role play of a conversation discussing where two people have been before and when they went to each place. Okay, if they're writing and performing the role play, that is guided. Number 8, the teacher uses PowerPoint slides to explain the difference between the present perfect and simple past. That one was a bit of a trick question. That's presentation. It's not controlled practice. It's not guided practice, not communicative practice. And number 9, they write out and act out a TV commercial using verbs in simple present, present perfect. And once again, if they're writing and acting it out, then that's guided. I'll move on now to the third part of the presentation, which is lesson plan phases for different lesson types that focus on speaking. So I'm going to talk about speaking or conversation classes in general, then grammar and pronunciation. Pronunciation will be a little different. So speaking lessons could be part of a grammar or pronunciation lesson. They're probably based around a topic or a situation or a task or a language function. Functions are kind of like generic tasks like thanking, apologizing, forgiving, asking permission, giving advice. They're all gerunds usually. Speaking may also be part of or integrated with post-reading or post-listening activities. Then it's addressing the reading or listening goals and speaking goals. Now, the question often comes up, well, should we have an emphasis on accuracy or on fluency? And you need both. You need to be accurate enough to make yourself understood. You need to be fluent enough that it doesn't pain the listener to listen to you talk. And when it comes to teaching conversation, there are indirect and direct approaches. Richards has talked about this, where we have, are we actually teaching skills or strategies or something for communication versus just setting them loose to talk and try to get fluent that way, and that's the indirect approach. Now the phases for these are going to be presentation, practice, production, PPP. Again, the practice is the same as controlled practice. Production, that's the guided practice and the communicative practice. You need both, but deciding which is which isn't so important. You need to just kind of be moving from easier to more challenging, more scaffolded to less scaffolded. When you're planning a grammar lesson, the 3 stages should be presentation, practice, production. Presentation could be deductive or inductive. Deductive is when we give them the rule and then give examples. Inductive is when we give them examples and they have to infer the rule. We may confirm that for them later, or you may be hardcore and not do it. I personally like to get confirmation just because I like to get confirmation. Practice, that's the controlled practice. Production, guided and communicative practice. Start with easier, move to more authentic. Now the practice could be spoken, written, or both. Of course, if this is a class that's focusing on conversation, you've got to have the spoken. Now, how many of each activity stage do you need? Well, how many do your students need in order to be ready for the next stage? Have they had enough controlled practice to move to production? If you just present something to them and then have them try to do a role play, try to act it out, they're probably going to fail. It's hard. They need to practice it, move the new content, grammar, vocabulary, whatever, from short-term memory into long-term memory. And that takes multiple repetitions too. Now, another thing that affects how much of each activity you need, or how many of each activity phase or lesson phase you need, is this something completely new, or is it review? Is it something you're reviewing from last week or from yesterday, or is this review from last year, in which case you probably need more of the low end? more of the easy stuff, more scaffolding, because they've forgotten more. Another factor is how bored are the students going to be? Are you giving them so much controlled practice that they're bored and getting out their phones and thinking about not coming next time to class? You don't want to overdo the controlled practice, just as you don't want to underdo it. You have to strike the right balance and keep an eye on how the class is going. Now, an obvious but crucial point is that the activity must elicit the target structure. It needs to practice what you're trying to teach. And I know the natural thing is that, well, duh, no one's so stupid that they would not do. Yeah, people make mistakes. What I think happens is people start planning an activity and then they change something in the activity. Say, oh, this would work better. This would be a more interesting thing. They change that and lose track of what they were focusing on, and it winds up being something that now focuses on a different grammar point. So here's a bad example. The grammar point in a lesson was the present perfect versus simple past. And the student, this was a master's student in TESOL writing a unit plan. They planned the activity of planning a trip with a travel agent. And that's good for suggestion modals. You could, you should, you ought to do this. It's okay for future verb tenses, okay? On day 1, you will do this. On day 2, you will do that. And in the afternoon, you will be, I don't know, swimming with the dolphins, whatever. It's okay for that. But it's not useful for present perfect versus simple past. So it's, I know it seems like a no-brainer, but smart people make mistakes too. Now, moving on to planning pronunciation lessons. I'm talking here about the systematic teaching of pronunciation, not learning how to pronounce this week's list of words. That's part of vocabulary learning. This is how to produce or how to pronounce certain sounds, suprasegmentals, things like stress, rhythm, intonation, connected speech, things like that. The first phase is description and analysis. That's presentation. Explain the sounds or the suprasegmentals or whatever and how they're made. Then we add an extra phase, listening discrimination. The students practice telling one sound or one suprasegmental pattern from another. There's no speaking yet. So raise your right hand if you hear ah, raise your left hand if you hear eh. It can be, or if you hear certainty tag questions, you're hungry, aren't you? Raise your right hand. If it sounds uncertain, you're hungry, aren't you? Raise your left hand. That would be an intonation example. So, but the students are not talking. They're just trying to hear the difference. Then you have the controlled practice, practice phase, and production. So the only difference for pronunciation is adding that listening discrimination step. They practice hearing it. Especially when there's a sound that doesn't exist in your own language, being able to hear that can be difficult. And it's a lot easier to produce the sound if you can hear the sound. Sorry. Now, an important term for pronunciation lessons is minimal pair. It's 2 words that differ by one sound, like ship, sheep. Another important term is a syn form, and that's 2 words that are not minimal pairs, but they sound similar, like kitchen chicken, plastic practice, and those can be easy to confuse also. Now, listening discrimination, when you are doing consonants and vowels, minimal pairs are very useful. I would say even essential a lot of times. You need to have those. For controlled practice, minimal pairs are very often going to be helpful. And for guided and communicative practice, minimal pairs may be useful also when you're planning these activities too. Now, one thing to note is that guided and communicative practice can be more difficult to plan than they are with grammar. It's a lot easier to think of a communicative task, something where you'd have to speak that involves a certain verb tense or singular plural or count non-count nouns or something. That's a lot easier to do than with pronunciation. You have to choose names or places or whatever that will use the target sound or sounds. And don't worry if it sounds a little silly, a little artificial. It's almost impossible to avoid. And honestly, the students are never that impressed with your amazing activity anyway. Even a wonderful activity, oh, that was pretty good. Okay, moving on. If it's a little goofy and it does the job, then it does the job. If the students think it's funny, okay, good. They're not falling asleep, at least if they're laughing. Now, going back to normal pairs, a few resources. There's a classic book called Pronunciation Pairs, if you can get your hands on that. There's the English Phonetics website, which is very complete, but it is British English. So if you are an American teaching an American accent, you'll have to watch the vowels a little. They do things with the vowels that seem odd to us. I'm sure that's true the other way as well. Englishclub.com is fairly complete. And then there's pronuncian.com. It's a bit complicated, but it might be useful too. And it's free, so you can't beat the price. Okay, here are a few references, and I hope this has been useful to you. And best of luck with your teaching and with helping your students learn English.